So, when you hear the name Karl Marx, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably communism, right? Revolutions, big political movements. But for this explainer, we're going to set aside Marx, the political icon. Instead, we're going to meet Karl Marx, the sociologist, a thinker who was just trying to figure out a world that had been completely turned upside down by the Industrial Revolution. And this, right here, is the central question, the huge paradox that really drove everything he wrote. He looked around and saw factories that could produce goods on a scale nobody had ever dreamed of. For the first time, it seemed like there was enough for everyone. And yet, all around him was just staggering poverty and suffering. How could that possibly be? It was this crazy split. On one side, you had the incredible promise of this new industrial age. The potential to feed, clothe, and house everyone was finally there. But the reality that Marx actually saw was a society breaking into two polar opposites. A tiny, tiny group of owners who were enjoying just unbelievable wealth, and then this huge majority of people, the workers, living in filth, totally at the mercy of the people who owned the factories. So, to make sense of this paradox, Marx came up with a really powerful theory. He argued that if you want to understand history, you shouldn't be looking at great kings or big ideas or even nations. Nope. He said the real engine pushing human history forward is something way more basic. It's the economic fight between social classes. This is probably his most famous line ever, and it's really the heart of his entire worldview. For Marx, every society you can think of, ancient Rome, feudal Europe, and of course, modern capitalism, is all defined by one fundamental conflict, a struggle between an oppressor class and an oppressed class. So let's break down the key players he saw in this struggle during his own time. First up, we have to understand the means of production. This is a super important concept. Basically, it's all the stuff you need to make other stuff. In a farming society, that's the land. In an industrial society, it's the factories, the machines, the raw materials, and the money to get it all started. For Marx, the single most important question you can ask about any society is this: who owns all that? And in the 19th century, the answer to that question was the bourgeoisie. This was Marx's name for that new capitalist class, the factory owners, the big bankers, the people with all the capital. They were the ones who owned the means of production. And on the other side of the conflict, you have the proletariat. This is the giant working class. They don't own any factories. They don't own any land. The only thing they have to their name is their own ability to work, what Marx called their labor power. And to stay alive, they have no other choice but to sell that labor power to someone from the bourgeoisie for a wage. And Marx didn't think this was some new thing that just popped up with capitalism. He saw it as just the latest chapter in a long, long story. Back in ancient times, it was slave owners versus slaves. In the Middle Ages, it was feudal lords versus serfs. And now, in his time, it was the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Each stage of history had its own unique form of exploitation, and he believed each one carried the seeds of its own downfall. So what was it about capitalism specifically that Marx saw as being so deeply flawed? He poured years of his life into his masterpiece, Das Kapital, basically to take the system apart piece by piece. He argued it was built on a bedrock of exploitation and was just fundamentally unstable. Let's dig into how he thought it all worked. Okay, the absolute key to understanding Marx's whole critique is this idea of surplus value. Here's how it works. He said a worker's wage isn't based on the actual value of what they create, not even close. Instead, the wage is just enough money to keep that worker alive and healthy enough to show up for work the next day. All that extra value the worker creates on top of that, that's the surplus value, and the capitalist pockets all of it as profit. For Marx, this wasn't just a smart business practice, it was exploitation, baked right into the DNA of the system. Let's just walk through that cycle. So the capitalist buys a worker's ability to work for, say, a whole day. During that day, the worker produces, let's say, $10 worth of stuff. The capitalist gets that $10, but he only pays the worker $2 in wages, just enough for rent and food. That leftover $8, that's the surplus value, that's the profit. And then the worker has to go spend their $2 just to survive, and they come back the next day to do it all over again. Now, this whole process had a really deep psychological impact that Marx called alienation. Think about it. Work is supposed to be this amazing expression of our creativity, right? It's what makes us human. But under this system, it becomes this dull, repetitive, soul-crushing task that someone else controls. So workers end up feeling most human when they're not at work, when they're doing their animal functions like eating or sleeping.
Their uniquely human spirit gets reduced to just an animal-like scramble for survival. And Marx argued that these dynamics create these vicious, self-destructive cycles. The constant competition between capitalists forces them to squeeze workers harder and harder and to replace them with machines whenever possible. But that creates unemployment. And when people are unemployed, they can't afford to buy all the stuff the factories are turning out. This leads to these huge crises of overproduction, what we'd call recessions or depressions today. And Marx was convinced these crises would just get worse and worse over time.
All right, so if capitalism was basically a ticking time bomb doomed to self-destruct, what did Marx think was going to come next? Well, this brings us to the most famous and definitely the most controversial part of his work, his prediction of a massive worldwide communist revolution.
The crucial spark, the trigger for this whole revolution, was something he called class consciousness. Marx predicted that as capitalism crammed more and more workers together into these miserable factory conditions, they'd eventually have a kind of light bulb moment. They'd stop seeing each other as competitors for jobs and start to realize they all had a common enemy, the capitalist system itself. They'd finally recognize their shared struggle and their collective power. So once the proletariat took power, what was the plan? Well, Marx and his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, laid out a program to start moving away from capitalism. This involved getting rid of private ownership of all the big stuff, the factories, the land, the banks, and putting it all under collective state control. The endgame, the ultimate goal, was to build a society with no class divisions at all, where things were made for the common good, not just for somebody's private profit. And this all builds up to that iconic, thundering conclusion of the Communist Manifesto. It's such a powerful and direct call to action. It really captures his belief that for the working class, revolution wasn't just a good idea, it was a historical necessity. They had nothing to begin with, so they had literally nothing to lose by trying to overthrow the whole system. Of course, we all know history took a bit of a different turn. That global workers' revolution, it never actually happened. So more than 150 years later, how are we supposed to look back on his ideas? Was he just a failed prophet, or was he a brilliant analyst who still has something to teach us?
Well, the verdict is pretty mixed. On one hand, let's be real, Marx got a lot wrong. He never saw the rise of a huge, stable middle class, which kind of softened that sharp class divide he predicted. And he totally underestimated how flexible capitalism could be, how it could adapt and reform itself with things like labor unions and government regulations. But on the other hand, some of his analysis was spookily accurate. He basically predicted globalization, that capitalism would have to spread across the entire planet. He brilliantly showed how economic power shapes political power. And his core ideas about the system's instability and its natural tendency to create massive inequality, well, those are still at the center of our economic debates today.
And that, I think, is the real key takeaway. If we separate Marx the prophet from Marx the analyst, you find this incredibly sharp critic of capitalism. The solutions he came up with might have failed spectacularly or led to terrible outcomes. But the questions he asked, questions about who really benefits from our economy, about the deep link between wealth and power, and about the human cost of progress, those are still some of the most important questions we can possibly ask about the world we live in. Which really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In an age where a few giant corporations have more power than many countries, where we're all worried about automation taking our jobs, and where the gap between the super rich and everyone else just keeps growing, maybe, just maybe, the ghost of capitalism's greatest critic still has some very important things to tell us.